The morning Callie Rowe signed the divorce papers, she wore a gray blazer she hadn't touched in 3 years, not because it was special, not because she wanted to look good for him, but because her mother had given it to her the week she passed, and Callie figured if she was going to walk into the hardest room of her life, she might as well bring someone steady with her. The lawyer's office smelled like old carpet and printer ink. Outside, February was doing what February always does in Ottawa, punishing everything it touched, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself, it just settles into your bones and stays. Callie sat on one side of the table. Her husband Declan Rowe sat on the other. She didn't look at him. She looked at the window instead, at the gray sky pressing down on the Rideau Canal, at a woman walking a dog along the path below. Some kind of golden retriever pulling hard on the leash thrilled about the snow. Callie thought, that dog has no idea. That dog is just running toward whatever smells good. She signed her name on 4 different pages. On the last one she noticed her hand wasn't shaking. She'd expected it to. She'd prepared herself for the tremor, the catch in her throat, the moment where grief would crack her open right there in front of the paralegal and the potted ficus in the corner, but her hand was steady. Almost strange how steady. Declan said something to his lawyer in a low voice. He laughed. Just a little, just enough, that particular laugh she knew. The one that meant he was performing comfort for someone watching. She didn't react. She capped the pen, slid it back across the table and stood up. They'd been married for 6 years. Which sounds like a long time until you start breaking it down. 6 years minus the 1.5 years she'd spent traveling for work, minus the 8 months he'd barely come home before midnight, minus the slow erosion of every small thing that used to mean something. Dinner conversations that dried up, vacations they kept planning and never took, the particular loneliness of lying next to someone who has already quietly chosen someone else. She hadn't known about Renata at first. Renata Voss worked in Declan's department at the architecture firm. Callie had met her twice, once at a firm Christmas party, once at a charity golf tournament she'd attended only to support Declan's boss. Renata was tall, laughed easily, had the kind of effortless social confidence that Callie sometimes envied and mostly just observed. She hadn't suspected. That was the part that still stung in a low-grade persistent way, not the betrayal itself but how long she'd simply not known. How she'd been living her life, doing her job, worrying about her own things while something was already long over. She found out in the most undramatic way possible. A phone notification she wasn't meant to see. Declan had left his phone on the kitchen counter while he showered. She hadn't snooped. She'd walked by to refill her coffee and the screen had lit up on its own. A message thread, a name, 3 words that rearranged everything. She stood there for a long time, holding her mug. Then she poured the coffee down the sink, went to her home office, closed the door quietly behind her, and sat down at her desk. She didn't cry right away. She thought about crying, but what she mostly felt in that first hour was something colder and more clarifying than grief. Something that felt almost like focus. Callie Rowe, Callie Hartwood before the marriage, was a senior portfolio manager at a mid-sized investment firm in downtown Ottawa. She'd worked there for 11 years. She understood risk. She understood how to read a situation early, assess the damage, and move strategically rather than reactively. She knew in that moment, sitting at her desk with her hands folded in her lap, that this was going to require the same thing. She did not confront Declan that night, or the next. She made dinner. She asked about his day. She listened to him talk about a condo project near Westboro that was giving him headaches, and she nodded in the right places, and she said that sounds frustrating, and she meant none of it and all of it at once. What she was doing, behind those steady eyes, was thinking. Her mother, a woman named Joan Hartwood who'd run a small bookkeeping business in Sudbury for 30 years, used to say, "Don't make a permanent decision in a temporary feeling." Joan had a lot of sayings like that, practical, almost irritating in how always turned out to be. Callie was not making any permanent decisions yet. She was paying attention. Over the next several weeks, she did 3 things. The first was to call her cousin, a family lawyer in Kingston named Bridget. Not Bridget Okafor, a different Bridget, Bridget Carlo, who'd handled Callie's mother's estate and whom Callie trusted completely. They met for lunch at a place near the waterfront. Callie ordered the salmon. She explained the situation in the same tone she'd used to describe a client file. Bridget listened without interrupting and then said, "Okay, before you do anything else, here's what I need you to do." The second thing was to pull every joint financial account they shared and document everything, every transfer, every purchase she hadn't made. There weren't dramatic amounts. Declan wasn't stupid enough for that, but there was a pattern. Restaurants she'd never been to, a weekend stay at a hotel in Montreal she'd never heard mentioned, small withdrawals that added up over 14 months to something that wasn't small at all. The third thing was harder to explain but it mattered most. 2 years before any of this, Callie's grandmother on her mother's side, a sharp-eyed woman from Timmins named Vera, had passed away and left Cassie a sum of money. Not enormous by some measures but significant by any reasonable one. Vera had been careful her whole life, invested modestly, lived quietly in the same house for 40 years, and believed deeply that a woman should always have something that was hers alone. Callie had never touched it. She'd kept it in a separate account, one she'd opened in her own name before the marriage, one that had never been discussed with Declan or folded into their joint finances. Not out of secrecy or suspicion, she hadn't known, then, that she'd need it. She'd just listened to her grandmother, the way she'd always listened to the women in her family, and done what they told her. That money, along with 12 years of careful, compounding decisions of her own, meant that when Callie finally sat down with Bridget and said I'm ready to move forward, she was not starting from nothing, she was starting from somewhere. Declan found out she knew on a Thursday evening in March. She'd chosen the moment carefully, not out of cruelty but because she wanted to have the conversation when she was calm, and he was unprepared. She'd learned from years of negotiating on behalf of clients that who controls the pace controls the outcome. She told him she knew about Renata. She told him she had documentation of the joint account activity. She told him she had already spoken to a lawyer and that the process would go smoothly if they both cooperated. She said all of this standing in the kitchen, still in her work clothes, with a glass of water on the counter beside her. He tried several things. First he tried denial, a reflex gone in about 45 seconds when she named specific dates and locations. Then he tried contrition, the version where he sat down heavily at the table and pressed his hands to his face and said he was sorry, he'd made a terrible mistake. He didn't know what had gotten into him. She watched that too, calmly the way you watch weather through a window. Then he tried something else. You always made me feel like I wasn't enough, he said. Like I wasn't as driven as you, like nothing I did mattered. She tilted her head. Is that what you believe? I'm just saying there's more to this than Declan. Her voice was even. I'm not here to fight with you. I'm here to tell you what's happening next. He was quiet for a long time. I want to keep the house, he said finally. She looked at the kitchen, the backsplash they'd chosen together from a tile catalog on a rainy Sunday. The drawer with the slightly broken handle she'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. The window over the sink where the afternoon light came in just right in November. Keep it, she said. The months that followed were, from the outside, unremarkable. She moved into a rental apartment in Centertown, a 2-bedroom on the 4th floor with good light and a view of the park. She painted one wall in the 2nd bedroom a deep sage green, the color her mother had always wanted for a reading room and never got around to. She went to work. She managed portfolios. She made decisions about other people's financial futures with the same steadiness she was applying to her own. Declan and Renata, from what she heard through mutual acquaintances, had begun appearing at the kinds of social events they'd always attended as a couple. He'd introduced her. People had opinions about this and shared those opinions with Callie in the hushed, slightly excited way people deliver information they believe is damaging. I heard they were at the Whitmore Gala together, her colleague mentioned once over coffee. Callie said and turned back to her screen. She was not indifferent, she was just occupied, because while all of that was happening, the social appearances, the sympathetic text messages, the careful updating of her relationship status on platforms she barely used, she was also doing something else. Her grandmother Vera had left her the inheritance with one note handwritten on a piece of lined paper that Callie had kept in the top drawer of her desk. Don't spend it small and don't spend it afraid. She hadn't. Over the past several years, she'd taken that original sum and grown it, quietly, methodically in the way she knew how. A stake in a commercial property in Canada, a minority interest in a small food services company that had since expanded to 3 provinces. A carefully managed investment account that most of her friends didn't know existed because she'd never seen a reason to mention it. She now worked with a financial advisor, a meticulous woman named Odette Brassard who operated out of a glass and brick office near the Byward Market, and who had the quality Callie valued above almost everything else. She said exactly what she meant. You're in a better position than most people twice your age, Odette had told her, at their meeting the previous autumn, as long as you don't do anything reckless. Callie had laughed, the first real laugh she'd had in a while. Reckless is not really my thing. Now 8 months later, sitting in the same chair across from the same desk, she was doing something she'd been thinking about for 2 years. She was setting up a holding company. Heartwood Capital. The name was her mother's maiden name, the same name she was reclaiming along with everything else. It would hold the property assets, provide a structure for future acquisitions. Odette had laid out 3 scenarios for the next 5 years. Callie had read all 3 and asked questions about the second one for 45 minutes. She drove home from that meeting in the early evening, the Ottawa River glinting gold off to her left, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happy, exactly not yet, but clear. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in April. She signed the papers, she shook hands with her lawyer. She walked out of the building into a pale spring afternoon, the kind of day Ottawa does in April when it's finally grudgingly deciding to warm up, the sky a washed-out blue, the trees just beginning cautiously to consider the possibility of leaves. Declan was outside with Renata. She hadn't expected that. They were standing on the sidewalk about 15 meters from the entrance. Not together exactly, not holding hands, but in that proximity that makes the relationship obvious. Declan had his hands in his coat pockets. Renata was in a camel trench coat. Callie didn't recognize her dark hair loose around her shoulders. Callie pulled her bag higher on her shoulder and walked toward them because the parking lot was in that direction and she wasn't going to reroute her own path on her own day. Declan looked up when he saw her. Something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly, more like the specific discomfort of a person who has decided they have nothing to be ashamed of but still feels the texture of shame. Callie, he said. She nodded. Declan. A pause. Renata looked at her with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite landing it. Then the sound of a car pulling up behind her. It wasn't flashy, it didn't need to be. It was a dark navy sedan, executive class, quiet engine, the kind of vehicle that doesn't announce itself. The driver stepped out and held the rear door open. His name was Foster Webb. Callie had met Foster 3 months ago, at a property investment conference in Toronto where she'd been a panelist. He was the founder of a real estate development group based in Vancouver, a quiet, precise man in his late 50s who had the habit of listening more than he spoke, and of only speaking when he had something worth saying. They'd been introduced through Odette, who had worked with his company a decade earlier. They'd had 2 follow-up calls about a potential co-investment, then a lunch in Toronto. Then a long conversation over coffee that had started as a business meeting and turned into something more like the kind of conversation you have when you realize you might actually like someone. She hadn't told anyone, mostly because it wasn't anyone's business, and partly because she hadn't been sure yet what it was. Foster didn't say anything when she got in. He handed her a coffee, the right order, the one she'd mentioned once in passing, and asked how she was. Fine, she said. He studied her for a moment. Really? She exhaled slowly, looked out the window as the car pulled away. Saw in the side mirror Declan standing on the sidewalk watching the car leave. Renata had taken half a step forward, a confused look on her face like she was trying to do a calculation that wasn't adding up. I will be, Callie said. Foster nodded. That was enough. She found out later, through the same loose network of mutual connections, that Declan had made a comment to someone at the firm. Something along the lines of, I always thought she needed me more than she let on. The person he'd said it to had relayed it to Callie's colleague, who'd relayed it to Callie with the cautious excitement of someone delivering news they're not sure how it will land. Callie had set down her lunch fork and thought about that for a moment. He thought she needed him more than she let on. She thought about the morning she'd found out, standing at the kitchen counter with her coffee, the notification lighting up the screen. The weeks after, methodical and quiet, doing what needed to be done. The long months of paperwork and restructuring and careful, unglamorous work. Odette's spreadsheets, Bridget's advice, the sage green wall in the second bedroom. She thought about her grandmother Vera's handwriting on a piece of lined paper. Don't spend it small and don't spend it afraid. She picked up her fork again. He was wrong, she said simply and took a bite of her lunch. Heartwood Capital officially registered that August. There was no party, no announcement. She told Odette, who said good and immediately started talking about the next quarter. She told Bridget over the phone, who said your grandmother would be pleased, which was the thing Callie most wanted to hear. She told her father, a quiet man named Howard Heartwood who lived in Sudbury and had never quite known what to make of his daughter's financial mind, but had always been proud of it anyway. Over dinner at a restaurant on Elgin Street when he came to visit. Your mother always said you were the one in the family who paid attention, he said. Callie looked at him across the table. She was right. Howard nodded slowly, the way he always did when he was moved and didn't want to show it. Then he picked up the menu. Do they do the trout here? The following spring, Heartwood Capital closed on its first major commercial acquisition. A mid-sized mixed-use property in the Glebe. Retail on the ground floor, residential units above, a building that had been undervalued for years because the previous owners hadn't known what they had. Callie knew what she had. She stood in the empty main floor the morning after the paperwork cleared, coffee in one hand, morning light coming in through the tall front windows, and looked at what had been a slightly tired retail space and was now hers. She didn't think about Declan. She thought about her mother's blazer, still hanging in her closet. She thought about a golden retriever pulling hard on a leash in the February snow. She thought about her grandmother writing something careful on a piece of lined paper, knowing, maybe, that someone would need it someday. She thought, This is what it feels like to not be afraid. The city hummed outside the windows, a streetcar went by. Somewhere nearby someone was unlocking a coffee shop and the smell of it drifted through the gap under the door. Callie Rowe, Callie Hartwood, she was using the name again now, took one long steady breath, and then she got to work.